This is called Flayed Ed. In 1957, after the body of Bernice Warden was found strung up and gutted like a deer carcass in his barn, Ed Gein was arrested, declared insane, and sent to Wisconsin's Central State Hospital, where he'd spend the rest of his life. By 1959, the people of Plainfield and the Sheriff's Department, who'd been the first on the scene at Ed's farm, had done a pretty good job of putting Ed's grisly crimes out of their mind and getting the town back to where it had been a couple of years earlier. By 1960, no one at the Sheriff's Department ever spoke about Ed, and only the youngest and greenest recruits were dumb enough to ask about him. The weeks of counting scalps and putting human bones into evidence bags were long behind them, and they returned to their more familiar duties, pulling drivers from ditches in the winter, investigating domestic disturbances, and bringing in drunken brawlers on the weekend. There'd never been many murders in Plainfield, and since Ed had gone off to the loony bin, not a single cannibal psychopath. By 1961, Ed's memory, his human skin furniture, and the strange skin suit he'd sewn from the desiccated flesh of female corpses had dulled to occasional Halloween water cooler jokes. But Ed's presence never disappeared entirely, and he continued to haunt the area around Plainfield right through the millennium. And then the flies came, and then the rains of blood. Then all of Plainfield's children went blind in a single night. Deep in the eastern sky, the source of light, fertility, and life, Xipe-Totec, Aztec warrior, the god of suffering, the lord of spring, the ruler of the east, often called the blood-red mirror by his followers, stirred from his sleep. He became an eagle and rode the winds, looking for his offerings and sacrifices, but found none. Starving and enraged, Xipe-Totec frowned, and blood and disease fell from the sky. Back in 1978, Ed had been relocated to the Mendota Mental Health Facility with Madison, Wisconsin. He died there in 1984 after serving as the hospital's barber for 5 years. No one at the hospital saw any problems giving Ed access to razors and scissors. In the segregated wards, the truth was Ed had never killed or even hurt a man. Ed's interests were fixed exclusively on women. What no one in the hospital, especially the doctors, understood was why. What the doctors called schizophrenia accompanied by psychosexual dementia, Ed called God. He knew the shape and the sacrifices of the old forgotten deities found acceptable, the blood they demanded, the skin dances they craved, were fed through the flesh of wise women, not foolish men. What tormented Ed more than being arrested, more than being locked up for decades, was that he hadn't finished his flayed offerings or properly done the offering dance. During his first years at the hospital, Ed was terrified. Eventually, he understood that he'd be long dead before the gods noticed the absence of their sustenance. In the spring of '84, when the cicadas chirped and mayflies appeared in swarms, Ed collapsed and was taken to the infirmary for the very last time. It was thrilling. He knew that death was finally coming for him. Xipe-Totec, our Lord of the Flayed One, is represented to mortals by a mask found in many Aztec archaeological sites. He's depicted as a man's face with blank eyes and what appears to be a mouth inside a larger, toothless mouth. In reality, the smaller mouth is that of an Aztec priest who wears the skin as a sacrifice, bloody side out. Blood and flesh are Xipe-Totec's nourishment. The dance in the flayed skin is the platter on which Xipe-Totec's meals are served. But, being good, God-fearing Christians, none of the residents of Plainfield, Wisconsin knew any of this. Around the millennium, when the blood rains first fell, Plainfield suffered terribly as they prayed fervently and sincerely to the wrong God. Their cattle convulsed and died in the fields. Ranchers and dairymen thought they had all contracted mad cow disease. Hazmat-suited men from the Center for Disease Control slaughtered and burned the cattle in the fields. Still, the CDC couldn't tell the farmers why their apples bled like gutted warriors when they picked them, or why the kernels inside their corn crops were the rotten teeth of the dead. News crews from around the world invaded Plainfield's sad, wet streets. The Army Corps of Engineers built levees to hold back the swollen, blood-colored rivers. The governor finally declared martial law, and National Guard troops moved in to keep order. The soldiers were soon felled with boils and a new Ebola-like disease that left them bleeding through their skin. And the flies never left. but spread from Plainfield out across Wisconsin, bringing disease and the awful red rains with them. In the eastern sky, Shipetotek's anger and appetite grew. He couldn't understand why, after all his warnings and punishments, the mortals wouldn't simply make the sacrifices that would end their misery. And from somewhere high above it all, Ed looked down and laughed an old coot's laugh. Thanks.